The chamber was not supposed to convene on a Saturday. Emergency sessions of the United Nations Security Council are not scheduled. They are demanded. And when Russia's ambassador Vasily Nebenzia stood at that podium on the morning of March 1st, 2026, and used two words that have not appeared together in formal UN Security Council language directed at the United States since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the room understood that something had changed. Not in the conflict, in the architecture around it. The two words were cynical violation. Not aggression, not provocation, not reckless escalation. Cynical violation of international law. That phrase was chosen by lawyers, reviewed by diplomats, cleared at the highest levels of the Russian Foreign Ministry before Nebenzia's lips formed the first syllable. It was not rhetoric. It was a legal and diplomatic positioning statement delivered through the most formal channel available to a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And, sitting 3 seats to Nebenzia's left, China's Ambassador Fu Kong nodded once before delivering his own statement in language, so precisely aligned with Moscow's that analysts tracking both delegations understood within minutes that the two statements had been coordinated before either ambassador entered the building. This was not a coincidence of outrage. This was a signal, carefully constructed, deliberately timed, aimed at multiple audiences simultaneously. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what that signal means, who it was aimed at, what it unlocks, and why the three words cynical violation of law may ultimately cost more than the strikes themselves. The strikes that triggered the emergency session had landed in the early hours of Friday, February 28, 2026. Operation parameters consistent with what Reuters had been reporting for 2 weeks. Multi-wave, sustained, targeting not just nuclear infrastructure, but state and security facilities that the previous Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025 had deliberately left untouched. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri had been the signature of Midnight Hammer. This operation was different in scale, different in target set, different in what it communicated about American intent. F-22 Raptors flying from RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk, England. F-15E Strike Eagles from Muwafaq Salty Air Base in Jordan. Strike packages coordinated with Israeli Air Force operations that had been prefaced by Marco Rubio's visit to Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv on February 28th. The same day Rubio landed in Tel Aviv. The same day the coordination was finalized. The same night the aircraft crossed Iranian airspace. The timing was not coincidental. It was architectural. Within 4 hours of the first strikes, Iran's mission to the United Nations had filed a formal protest with the Secretary General. Within 6 hours, Russia had requested an Emergency Security Council session. Within 8 hours, China had co-sponsored the request. The procedural speed was itself a message. Russia and China did not need to confer about whether to act. They had already decided. The statements that Nebenzia and Fu Kong delivered at that Saturday morning session had not been written overnight. They had been written in advance, filed into diplomatic archives before the first American bomb landed on Iranian soil. This is what preparation looks like when 2 permanent Security Council members have concluded that a moment is coming and have decided exactly what they will say when it arrives. Nebenzia's full statement ran to 11 minutes. But the phrase that traveled through every diplomatic cable on Earth within the hour was the one he delivered in the second minute. What we witnessed last night was not self-defense. It was not preemptive action. It was a cynical violation of the foundational principles of international law and the United Nations Charter. Cynical. That specific word. Not illegal, not unlawful. Cynical. Cynical carries a meaning in diplomatic language that illegal does not. Illegal means you broke the rule. Cynical means you knew you were breaking it, used the rule's language to justify breaking it, and expected the institution to absorb the contradiction without consequence. Cynical is the word diplomats use when they are accusing a permanent member of weaponizing the very system it helped create. It has appeared in Russian and Chinese UN statements directed at smaller nations, at non-permanent members, at countries without veto power, directed at the United States in a formal Security Council chamber on the record. It carries a weight that the word illegal by itself does not. Fu Kong's statement used the same word within 90 seconds of Nebenzia's. The coordination was visible to everyone in the chamber. It was meant to be visible. The American response was delivered by Ambassador Dorothy Shea. Shea had been confirmed to the position 3 weeks earlier, inheriting a posting that had become the most watched diplomatic seat on Earth in the span of a single month. Her statement invoked Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Article 51 is the self-defense provision, the clause that permits member states to use force when responding to an armed attack. Shea's argument was constructed carefully. Iran had formally declared all American bases in the region legitimate targets in its February 20th letter to the Security Council itself. Iran had struck Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar following the June 2025 Midnight Hammer operation. Iran had attempted to seize an American tanker in the Strait of Hormuz on February 3rd. Iran was actively enriching uranium beyond the thresholds permitted under any negotiated framework. Iran had, in Shay's framing, established through its own actions and declarations the predicate for an armed attack that Article 51 authorized a response to. The argument was legally sophisticated. It had been prepared by the State Department's legal advisor's office over weeks. Russia and China had anticipated every word of it. Nebenzia's rebuttal did not address Article 51 on its merits. It addressed something more fundamental. The United States, he said, is not defending itself. It is enforcing its preferences at gunpoint and calling the gunpoint self-defense. That sentence landed in the chamber the way a weight lands on a scale that was already close to tipping, because it was not wrong in the way that could be easily dismissed. The Iranian bases and strikes Shay had cited were real. The Iranian letter was real, the enrichment was real, but the 2 carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea were also real. The 50 additional fighter jets moved in 24 hours were real. The 73 target list from Netanyahu was real. The question of which came first, American military pressure or Iranian declarations, was not answerable in a single Security Council session. And Nebenzia knew it. That was why he did not try to answer it. He simply named the pattern and let the chamber sit with it. China's Fu Kong added a layer that Nebenzia had deliberately left to Beijing, the economic layer. Fu Kong noted that the Strait of Hormuz carries energy supplies for dozens of nations that had no role in the conflict that led to the strikes. He named them, not by implication, by name: Japan, South Korea, India, Singapore, Pakistan, every Southeast Asian economy, every African nation dependent on Gulf energy imports. These countries, Fu Kong said, did not vote for this conflict. They did not authorize it. They did not benefit from the conditions that created it, and they will pay its economic costs in full. That statement was not addressed to the Security Council chamber. It was addressed to the 120 nations of the Global South that China has been systematically courting through the Belt and Road Initiative, through BRICS expansion, through every diplomatic forum where Washington's unilateral action can be contrasted with Beijing's multilateral positioning. Fu Kong was not making a legal argument. He was making a constituency argument, and the constituency he was speaking to was sitting in the General Assembly Hall 2 floors above the Security Council chamber, following the proceedings on monitors, calculating what this moment meant for their own relationships with Washington and Beijing simultaneously. Now let me show you what the Russia-China coordination at the UN actually unlocks. Because mainstream coverage is treating Saturday's session as a diplomatic formality, a protest without teeth, an emergency meeting that produces a statement nobody enforces. That framing misses what is actually happening. The cynical violation language is not the end of the Russia-China response. It is the beginning of the justification architecture for everything that follows. Here is how that architecture works. When Russia and China formally characterize American strikes as a cynical violation of international law on the record at the Security Council, they create a legal and diplomatic foundation for actions they have already decided to take. Actions that would otherwise require explanation now have pre-built justification. Actions that would otherwise look like escalation now look like principled response to documented lawlessness. This is not cynical in the way Nebenzia used the word. It is strategic, and it is running precisely on schedule. The first thing that coordination unlocks is the arms question. Russia has been Iran's primary advanced military technology partner for years. The Chinese YC-8B UHF-band 3-dimensional long-range anti-stealth surveillance radar already deployed to Iran before the strikes was not Iranian equipment. It was Chinese technology specifically designed to track stealth aircraft, including the B-2 Spirit bombers that conducted both Midnight Hammer in June 2025 and the current operation. After Saturday's Security Council statement, the question of what additional Russian and Chinese military technology flows to Iran carries a different political calculation. Before Saturday, providing Iran with advanced air defense systems or missile technology after American strikes would have required Moscow and Beijing to absorb significant diplomatic cost. After Saturday, providing those systems is a response to a documented cynical violation of international law. The justification is pre-built. The pathway is open. The only question is, what moves through it and how fast? Iran's air defense network was already being upgraded before the strikes. Russian S-400 components had been discussed in bilateral military channels for months. The strikes that landed on Friday night did not destroy Iran's ballistic missile inventory. They targeted nuclear infrastructure and state security facilities. Iran's missile arsenal, the asset that Khamenei described as capable of sinking an aircraft carrier, survived the opening American operation largely intact. The Defense Intelligence Agency's March 2025 report had described Iran as possessing the Middle East's largest stockpile of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. Surviving an American strike does not mean that inventory is unchanged. It means it is operational, available, and now authorized by every calculation in Tehran for use in a way that the pre-strike deterrence calculus had held in check. The retaliation timeline that American planners were modeling as the most urgent immediate consequence was not theoretical by Saturday morning. It was operational. The proxy activation dimension of post-strike reality was already visible in the hours before Nebenzia took the podium. Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq issued a statement within 3 hours of the first strikes, confirming offensive operations against American targets had commenced. The 5,000 Iraqi militia fighters who had entered Iran from southern border crossings in January were not observers. They were positioned. Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, which had been recruiting fighters for suicide operations since late January, confirmed its units were activated. Hezbollah in Lebanon had not yet issued a formal military statement as of Saturday morning's Security Council session. But Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qassem had said in January that his organization was not neutral and would determine the manner of its response. Not neutral, after American strikes on Iranian state and security facilities, is a different category of not neutral than not neutral during diplomatic standoff. The New York Times reported Saturday, citing Western officials, that intercepted communications in the hours after the strikes showed significantly elevated coordination across the entire Iranian proxy network simultaneously. Not sequential activation. Simultaneous, 7 countries, 1 signal, sent and received before the Security Council chamber had finished filling. The Strait of Hormuz, the question moved from theoretical to operational the moment the strikes landed. Iran's parliament had voted to close the strait after the June 2025 Midnight Hammer operation. That vote had not been implemented because Supreme Leader Khamenei and the Supreme National Security Council had not approved it. The threshold for approval was a level of external pressure that made the economic self-harm of closure worth accepting. American strikes on state and security facilities, not just nuclear infrastructure, crossed a threshold that the June 2025 strikes had deliberately been calibrated to stay below. This operation was not calibrated to stay below that threshold. By Saturday morning, Iranian state media was reporting that the Supreme National Security Council had convened an emergency session. The outcome of that session had not been officially announced by the time Nebenzia stood at the Security Council podium. But the shipping industry was not waiting for an announcement. War risk premiums on vessels operating in the Persian Gulf spiked 340% in the first 4 hours after the strikes. Not 34%, not 134%, 340%. Lloyd's of London market sources confirmed that several underwriters had suspended new coverage for Persian Gulf transits entirely pending reassessment. Not raised premiums, suspended coverage. When insurers suspend coverage, captains cannot legally sail. When captains cannot legally sail, the physical closure of the strait begins not with Iranian mines or gunboats, but with an insurance spreadsheet in London. The oil price movement that followed was the fastest single-session spike since the September 2019 Houthi attack on Saudi Aramco infrastructure. Brent crude opened Friday's Asian session above $70. By the time New York markets opened on Friday morning, before the Security Council session, before the proxy activation statements, Brent crude was trading at $94. By Friday close, it had reached $103 per barrel before a single Hormuz tanker had been turned back, before a single Iranian mine had been confirmed, before a single proxy strike on Gulf energy infrastructure had landed. This was pure probability pricing. The market's collective assessment that what came next would be worse. JP Morgan's $120 to $130 per barrel closure scenario was no longer a modeling exercise. It was a price target with a visible pathway. The $103 that closed Friday's session was not the number. It was the direction. And the direction had one destination if the Security Council session on Saturday produced what every analyst tracking it expected it to produce, which was a Russian and Chinese veto of any resolution authorizing ceasefire monitoring or calling for immediate cessation of hostilities, which is exactly what happened. The vote came at 11:47, Saturday morning New York time. The United Kingdom had drafted a resolution in the 4 hours between the emergency session being called and the chamber convening. The resolution called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, called for the protection of civilian infrastructure, called for unimpeded humanitarian access to affected areas in Iran. It did not condemn the American strikes explicitly. British diplomacy rarely does in its first draft. It was designed to pass with the abstentions of non-aligned members and the yes votes of Western allies. Russia vetoed it within 90 seconds of the vote being called. China vetoed it 4 seconds later. The United States did not need to veto. The American strikes were the subject of the resolution. Washington voted no. 3 permanent members voting against a resolution calling for cessation of hostilities in an active military conflict involving strikes on a non-nuclear weapon state's civilian-adjacent infrastructure. The chamber absorbed that outcome with the stillness of people who understood that the Security Council had just demonstrated its own irrelevance to the crisis it was convened to address. This was not unprecedented. It was the logical endpoint of a veto architecture that had been building since 2022. But its demonstration in this specific context on this specific Saturday carried its own weight. because it meant that the institutional mechanism designed to prevent exactly this kind of conflict had been rendered inoperative by the same powers whose cooperation was required to make it functional. Nebenzia's statement after the veto was the one that will be quoted in diplomatic histories of this period. He did not celebrate the veto. He did not declare victory. He said one sentence that contained the entire architecture of what comes next. The Security Council has shown today that it cannot stop what one of its permanent members has decided to start. That is not a failure of this institution. That is the beginning of a different kind of world. A different kind of world. Those 5 words were chosen as carefully as cynical violation had been chosen 40 minutes earlier. They were not a threat. They were an announcement. An announcement that the rules-based international order that the United States had spent 70 years building and leading was entering a phase where its primary architect had demonstrated that the rules applied to everyone except the architect, and that Russia and China had decided that demonstration was the moment to begin building the alternative architecture they had been designing for a decade. The Global South response was not going to wait for careful diplomatic formulation. It was already moving before the Security Council session ended. India's Ministry of External Affairs issued a statement within 2 hours of the strikes calling for immediate de-escalation and expressing deep concern about the implications for regional stability and global energy security. India imports approximately 2.2 million barrels of crude oil per day through the Strait of Hormuz. 60% of its natural gas supplies move through that same corridor from Qatar. India's statement was measured, but measured in the context of India's usual diplomatic language toward Washington, represented a significant departure. India had been carefully cultivating both its American strategic partnership and its Russian energy relationship since 2022. Saturday's events forced a recalibration. Turkey's foreign ministry used language closer to Russia's than to Washington's in its initial response, calling the strikes a dangerous escalation that threatened regional stability and violated the principles of the UN Charter. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey's foreign ministry using UN Charter violation language about an American military operation on the same morning that Russia and China were using it at the Security Council was not an accident of timing. It was a signal about where Ankar's calculation had landed. South Africa, Brazil, and Indonesia, 3 of the largest economies in the Global South, issued a joint statement calling for an emergency UN General Assembly session under the Uniting for Peace resolution. The Uniting for Peace resolution allows the General Assembly to convene when the Security Council is deadlocked by veto. It has been used before, against the United States in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. The fact that 3 major Global South economies were invoking it within hours of Saturday's Security Council session was a precise historical reference that every diplomat in the building recognized immediately. The economic cascade that followed the Security Council session moved faster than the diplomatic one. Asian markets opened Sunday evening. The session had ended Saturday noon New York time. Asian traders had the entire weekend to price what they had seen. The Nikkei opened down 6.2%. Japan's exposure to Hormuz disruption was not abstract. 95% of Japanese crude oil imports came from the Middle East. 80% of those moved through the strait. The Caspian Sol dropped 7.1%. South Korea's 200-day strategic petroleum reserve was now a countdown clock rather than a comfort margin. The Hang Seng dropped 5.8%. Chinese state media reported the market movements without editorial comment, which in Chinese financial media is itself an editorial comment. Shanghai Composite opened lower. The government's sovereign wealth funds were visible in the market within the first hour, buying to prevent a full cascade, spending reserves to demonstrate stability. Demonstrating stability is itself a cost. Brent crude opened Sunday's Asian session at $109, $6 above Friday's close, before a single Hormuz tanker had officially been turned back, before any formal Iranian strait closure declaration had been issued. At $109, the Oxford Economics 6% U.S. inflation scenario was not a forecast. It was a current trajectory. At $120, which J.P. Morgan analysts said Sunday morning was the baseline case for a sustained conflict, the Federal Reserve's impossible choice arrived ahead of schedule. Raise rates into a weakening economy and trigger recession. Hold rates and watch inflation reach levels not seen since 1980. Either path landed on the same place. On voters, on households, on the working class. Americans who elected the administration that authorized the strikes, and who would pay the $6 gasoline price before the midterm election season began. The Wall Street Journal reported Sunday evening what sources inside the National Security Council had been telling reporters on background since Saturday morning. The administration had not fully wargamed the Security Council response scenario, not the veto. The veto was expected. The Global South Coalition response, the speed of it, the coordination of it, the Uniting for Peace invocation within hours. One senior administration official described the Saturday response as moving faster and with more organizational coherence than anticipated. More organizational coherence than anticipated. That phrase tells you something that no formal briefing document will say directly. It tells you that the diplomatic cost calculation that preceded the authorization decision had underweighted the degree to which Russia and China had prepositioned their response. Prepositioned means ready, means drafted, means coordinated with third parties in advance, means that when Nebenzia said cynical violation of international law on Saturday morning, he was not reacting, he was executing. The arms supply question moved from theoretical to urgent on Sunday. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov told state media Sunday afternoon that Russia reserved the right to review all existing limitations on defensive military cooperation with sovereign nations facing illegal aggression, defensive military cooperation, existing limitations. Those two phrases together describe the arms supply architecture that has governed Russian-Iranian military relations since the JCPOA negotiations. Russia has sold Iran advanced military technology. It has historically calibrated those sales against diplomatic cost. After Saturday's Security Council performance, after the cynical violation statement, after the veto, after the announcement of a different kind of world, the diplomatic cost of advanced arms transfers to Iran had been deliberately and publicly reduced to zero. Ryabkov was not announcing a specific transfer. He was announcing that the category of action was now available. The specific transfers would follow in channels that public statements would not describe. S-300 and S-400 air defense system components, advanced electronic warfare equipment, satellite imagery sharing agreements, signals intelligence cooperation. None of these would be announced. All of them would be visible in the operational environment within weeks. China's response was economic before it was military. Within 24 hours of the Security Council session, Beijing announced a review of existing trade and financial arrangements with parties to the conflict. The language was vague, deliberately so. Vague announcements from the Chinese Foreign Ministry about reviewing arrangements or how Beijing signals without committing. But the direction of the signal was unmistakable. China holds approximately $850 billion in United States Treasury securities. China is the second largest foreign holder of American government debt after Japan. China does not need to sell those treasuries to use them as leverage. It needs only to stop buying new ones when existing ones mature. Reducing Chinese treasury purchases by even a fraction of annual rollover volume tightens American financial conditions in ways that the Federal Reserve cannot fully offset without raising interest rates further. Raising interest rates further into an oil shock recession is the economic equivalent of treating a fever by turning up the heat. The announcement of a review of existing arrangements on Sunday was China picking up the instrument and placing it visibly on the table, not playing it, placing it, where everyone could see it. The domestic Iranian picture that emerged from Saturday's first reports was different from what American planners had publicly characterized as the expected post-strike environment. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had said in the week before the strikes that senior Iranian leaders were moving tens of millions of dollars out of the country. He described it as evidence that the regime was abandoning ship. World Bank projections from October 2025 had Iran's economy shrinking in both 2025 and 2026, with annual inflation rising toward 60%. Protests had been ongoing across all 31 Iranian provinces since December 28, 2025. Initially economic, expanding into broader political demands. The American calculation, publicly stated by J.D. Vance and implied in every administration briefing, was that strikes combined with domestic instability would accelerate regime collapse. The population would see the regime's vulnerability, the security forces would fracture, the leadership would flee, the Islamic Republic would end not with a military victory but with an implosion. That calculation was not validated by Saturday's first reports from inside Iran. It was complicated by them. Iranian state television broadcast continuously from the hours after the strikes, not showing damage, showing crowds. Crowds in Tehran's Azadi Square, crowds in Isfahan, crowds in Mashhad. Not celebrating the regime, not supporting the strikes, demonstrating the oldest political dynamic in the textbook of military intervention, the rally around the flag effect. Populations that have been protesting their own government for months will, under certain conditions, close ranks against an external enemy. Saturday appeared to be producing those conditions. This was not guaranteed to last. Rallying effects are temporary. Economic pain is persistent. But in the immediate 24-hour window after strikes, the calculation that domestic instability would accelerate under military pressure was producing the opposite of its expected result. An opposite of expected results in post-strike environments are where extended conflicts are born. The NBC News analysis that had been published Tuesday before the strikes had warned about exactly this dynamic. Although weakened and facing a domestic crisis, Iran's regime still had substantial firepower that could inflict damage on American interests and allies in the region, disrupt the global economy, and trigger a protracted conflict in response to a United States military attack. Protracted conflict, The Pentagon had warned Trump before authorization about the risks of a drawn-out conflict, including potential American casualties, depleted munitions, and strained regional defenses. Trump had publicly disputed those warnings. But the architecture visible by Saturday morning, simultaneous proxy activation across 7 countries, oil at $109, Russian and Chinese diplomatic cover pre-positioned, Global South coalition invoking uniting for peace within hours, Iranian crowds filling public squares, was not the architecture of a brief, decisive operation. It was the architecture of something that had no visible endpoint. The Watson Institute at Brown University had calculated the total cost of American wars since 2001 at over $8 trillion across 2 decades. Those wars were fought against opponents who could not close the Strait of Hormuz, could not activate proxy networks across 7 countries simultaneously, could not trigger Russian and Chinese diplomatic cover that reduced the cost of advanced arms transfers to zero, could not invoke global South coalitions with enough organizational coherence to surprise National Security Council planners on the morning after strikes. The $6 trillion figure that had been the pre-strike estimate was being revised upward before Sunday's Asian markets opened, not by economists, by events. The specific financial exposure of the 35 countries most dependent on Persian Gulf energy had not changed since Thursday. What had changed was the probability distribution across the scenarios those countries had been planning for. Japan's 200-day reserve had not been touched yet, but the trajectory toward touching it had accelerated from a conditional future to a current present. South Korea's emergency planning sessions were now operational sessions. The contingency scenarios that officials had described in the week before strikes as planning for potential disruptions were being implemented. Singapore, the primary refining and trading hub for Middle Eastern crude supplying all of Southeast Asia, was managing vessel routing decisions in real time. The 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations was consuming energy faster than its domestic production could sustain before the strikes. After the strikes, the gap between consumption and domestic supply was the same. The supply that bridged that gap was now subject to a probability distribution that had shifted decisively toward disruption. Pakistan's situation, energy imports interacting with existing economic fragility, was not a financial problem anymore. It was a food security and social stability problem with a 6-week lag before it became visible in retail prices. 240 million people. A government already managing a debt crisis and an IMF program. A 50% rise in energy import costs arriving before any international assistance mechanism could mobilize. Pakistan had not fired a missile, had not taken a position in the conflict, had not voted at the Security Council. It was paying the price anyway, because that is what $109 oil does to an economy with limited foreign exchange reserves when the alternative routing for its energy supply does not exist. The Uniting for Peace resolution request from South Africa, Brazil, and Indonesia was procedurally significant in ways that the Saturday afternoon news cycle had not fully processed. The resolution was invoked once before against a permanent Security Council member in a context directly analogous to Saturday's. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the United States itself had used the Uniting for Peace mechanism to force a vote in the General Assembly condemning the British and French invasion of Egypt. The irony of the United States now being on the receiving end of the same procedural mechanism it had used in 1956 to enforce international law against its own allies was not lost on the diplomats invoking it. It was the point. The General Assembly cannot authorize military action. It cannot impose sanctions. It cannot compel compliance. But it can pass resolutions that 120 nations vote for, and 120 nations voting that American military action constitutes a violation of the UN Charter creates a diplomatic record. A record that complicates every subsequent American diplomatic initiative, a record that every country calculating whether to align with Washington or with the emerging Russia-China alternative architecture will cite when making that calculation. A record that does not expire. The deepest consequence of Saturday's Security Council session was not the veto. It was not the cynical violation language. It was not the oil price or the equity markets or the proxy activations. It was what the session demonstrated about the institutional architecture that has governed international relations since 1945. The Security Council was designed to prevent exactly this scenario. 5 permanent members with veto power, the theory went, would prevent any single nation from using military force without the collective agreement of the great powers. The theory assumed the great powers would remain aligned on fundamental norms. That assumption has not been valid since 2022 at the latest. What Saturday demonstrated was not that the assumption had become invalid. That was already known. What Saturday demonstrated was that the system could not adapt to its own invalidation. Russia and China could veto any resolution constraining American action. The United States could veto any resolution constraining Russian or Chinese action. The mechanism designed to enforce global norms had become the mechanism that permanently immunized its permanent members from those norms. And when Nebenzia said the beginning of a different kind of world, He was not predicting that outcome. He was announcing that the work of building the infrastructure for that different world had already begun and was now operating ahead of schedule. There's a number that moves through every layer of what Saturday produced. Not $109, not $6 trillion, not 340%. The number is 72. 72 hours is the window that military planners describe as the critical post-strike stabilization period. In the first 72 hours, proxy networks are activating, or they are not. In the first 72 hours, strait closure decisions are being made, or they are not. In the first 72 hours, Russian and Chinese arms transfer channels are being opened, or they are not. In the first 72 hours, the Global South diplomatic coalition is organizing at a pace that becomes self-sustaining, or it fragments. In the first 72 hours, Iranian domestic politics produces rally around the flag consolidation, or begins to fracture under strike pressure. Every decision made in every capital on Earth in the 72 hours after American bombs landed on Iranian soil was made with knowledge of what had happened at the Security Council on Saturday morning. The cynical violation statement, the coordinated Chinese echo, the veto, the announcement of a different kind of world, these were not reactions to the strikes. They were the first moves of the response architecture that Russia and China had been building since the moment American carrier strike groups began moving toward the Arabian Sea. The strikes gave that architecture its activation moment. And 72 hours into that moment, every indicator was running in the same direction. Oil at $109 and rising. Proxy networks activated across 7 countries simultaneously. Global South Coalition organized faster than National Security Council planners had anticipated. Russian arms transfer limitations publicly declared reviewable. Chinese Treasury review announced. Iranian crowds filling public squares. Insurance coverage suspended for Persian Gulf transits. The 40,000 to 50,000 American service members across 19 locations in 8 countries were 72 hours into a conflict that had no announced endpoint, no defined objective beyond what had already been struck, no plan for the morning after, just the architecture of a world that Nebenzia had announced was different now, and the 3 kilometers of water between Iran and Oman through which 20 million barrels of oil still moved every day, because they had not stopped yet, because the decision that stopped them had not been made yet, because the 72 hours were not over yet. And in the silence between that Saturday morning Security Council session and whatever came next, every number that mattered was moving in the same direction, toward the moment when the assumption that had held for 40 years finally met the architecture that had been built specifically to end it.